again, but luckily, well, I had to commit a sin. Yes, I like my PS5, but luckily we got it back. Hang on. At S position run fill. Let's see, at 1, at 7, at 4, at -1, at -1, at -4, error 0 replace. No error. Replace stone. Oh, come on, you dummy. There we go. I love this sign. It's a really spooky sign, and it really gets the point. It says, "Stop. Prevent your death. Go no further." And it's about this caving sign. I love the design of this fact. It got the point straight across. So this sign was made to stop people from diving in this cave. Here, I'll read it off. Fact. More than 300 divers, including open waters. This one. Fact. You need training to dive. You need cave training and cave equipment to cave dive. Fact. Without cave training and cave equipment, divers can die here. And in the last fact, it can happen to you. There is nothing in this cave worth dying for. Do not go beyond this point. Strange discovery. The strange disappearance.
We didn't expect to see you. Well, I heard you were looking for Robert Downey Jr. type, and I thought I would be back.
On August 18th, 2010, Ben McDaniel was diving in Vortex Spring Cave when something went horrifyingly wrong. And this event would go on to be the greatest mystery in diving history. This is his story. This video is brought to you by Babbel, one of the top language learning apps in the world. If you've listened to this channel long enough and you're familiar with some of the places in my videos, you probably know that I downright butcher names and words on occasion, especially words from foreign countries in different languages. This is why I've been super happy to work with Babbel and use their app over the past several months. Not only have I been able to work on that pronunciation with Babbel's speech recognition, just like this.
Faire de la plongée.
Faire de la plongée. But the coolest thing about Babbel is that it has me go through a series of different ways to learn the same concepts, similar to how I was taught French in school. And this is because all of Babbel's lessons were designed by real language teachers. It's hard to overstate just how powerful this is in accelerating your learning and teaching you to have real-world conversations. And the best part about this is that when I'm away from the computer, I can do all of the lessons from the Babbel app on my phone. With all these features, it's been super easy and enjoyable to brush up on my French speaking. So, I'm curious to hear what languages all of you would want to learn, because right now, Babbel is offering 60% off a subscription for all Scary Interesting viewers. And this comes with a 20-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk in giving it a try. The link on screen now, or in the description below. With that said, let's get into today's video. On Wednesday, August 18th, Ben McDaniel returned to a beach house owned by his parents in Santa Rosa, after having spent the last few weeks with them where they were living at the time in Tennessee. At around midday, he went to a local diving spot known as Vortex Spring, just north of Ponce de Leon, and completed one dive. During this first trip, other divers in the water noticed him looking closely at the entrance to a cave deep inside the spring. It looked as though he was studying, like he was planning something. Into the water and then went into the dive shop near the spring and refilled his tanks. This was caught on the security cameras inside of the shop. Ben then spent the rest of the afternoon hanging around the shore of the spring, testing out his equipment and writing notes in what looked to be his dive logs. That evening, after a sweltering day of 32 Celsius or 90 Fahrenheit, Ben looked as though he was prepared for another dive. At 7:30 p.m., he called his mom and had a completely normal conversation with her, and then when he got off the phone, he finished putting on all of his equipment and then entered the spring once again. Little did his mom know that this would be the last time she ever spoke to her son. As Ben swam through the 20 Celsius or 68 Fahrenheit water, he ran into two of the dive shop's employees who were also on their way back from a dive and noticed that Ben was wearing lights and a helmet. This suggested that he planned to enter the cave, despite the fact that the cave in Vortex Spring has a rebar gate that is padlock closed, and the only people to have keys to this gate are the employees of the dive shop. Divers who want to explore it have to have explicit permission to enter, and permission is only granted to individuals who hold a valid cave diving certificate. The dive shop employees knew that Ben didn't have either of these, but suspected for some time that he'd been forcing the gate open anyway. In fact, oftentimes they wait on shore when Ben went on these late-night dives until they saw bubbles on the surface of the spring. This indicated to them that Ben was doing decompression stops and then knowing he was safe, they'd go home for the day. On this occasion, one of the dive shop employees just decided to swim down with Ben and open the gate for him. The two of them then swam into the large cavern at the bottom of the spring and then passed this infamous sign. This might be the single most recognizable sign in all of diving. It is a picture of the Grim Reaper with the word "stop" in big bold letters.
Prevent your death. Go no further.
True stats about the number of divers who have died in caves, just like the one past the sign. But obviously, this was no concern for Ben, so the two of them continued on. Following that sign, they reached the rebar gate, which the employee opened, and then he watched as Ben squeezed his way under the narrow overhanging limestone and out of view. As far as anyone knows, this is the last time Ben was ever seen. Ben McDaniel was born on April 15, 1980 in Memphis, Tennessee, and was the oldest of three kids. By the time he was in his 20s, his parents had done well for themselves and had become quite wealthy, but Ben was having the exact opposite experience. The late 2000s were a really rough time in his life. First, he lost his 22-year-old younger brother to a stroke, which was obviously devastating. Not only was he extremely young, but the two of them were close and regularly saw each other and hung out despite the age difference. Tragically, Ben was also the one to find him unconscious at their home and tried desperately to revive him, but he was pronounced dead when paramedics arrived. Their parents later set up a foundation to help other individuals with similar conditions, which Ben was involved in. But then, even more tragically, it was later revealed that it wasn't a stroke after all. It was a drug overdose for drugs he hadn't been prescribed. At the same time all of this was happening, Ben was simultaneously going through a hard divorce, and his construction business was failing in the wake of the economic downturn in the late 2000s.
2008, 2009
so bad,
recession.
He became $50,000 in debt to the IRS and was forced to move back in with his parents. It was just an incredibly challenging couple of years for Ben, and his parents noticed how it had impacted him and changed his personality. With them being in a fortunate enough situation, they suggested to him that he take a sabbatical and go live at their beach house in Florida. They more or less said, take your dog and go relax. We'll support you in the meantime until you get back on your feet. Ben accepted this offer and then moved to the beach house in Santa Rosa in April 2010. This ended up being a great decision, and within a couple of weeks of living there, both his parents and his girlfriend noticed that he seemed to be more and more like his old self. He was starting to think about the future again and was less focused on how rough things had been in the past little while. Part of what motivated this change was that he was able to pursue one of his passions, which was scuba diving. He had already loved scuba diving since he started going in his teenage years, but since he was in the perfect area and had the time to do it, he became obsessed with it while living at the beach house. In particular, he loved going to a local spot known as the Vortex Spring, because even though he was right on the coast, he preferred diving in fresh water. Freshwater springs, like the Vortex Spring, are abundant in this area of Florida, but even among all these other springs, Vortex Spring is sort of unique. It's home to the largest diving facility in the state, and it's perfect for divers of all levels because the water is super clear and the temperature of the water is warm enough that divers only need wetsuits when diving. For newer divers, there's lots of wildlife to see and room to practice, and for more experienced and more technical divers, there is a massive cave at the bottom of the spring. If you've got the certifications, you're free to explore both of these areas, but the real attraction is obviously the cave. From the water's surface, the spring extends down to a depth of 60 feet or 18 meters. This is where a large cavern starts. The opening to this cavern is 9 feet by 12 feet and has a handrail mounted along the wall. This cavern extends 300 feet further, all the way to a depth of 115 feet or 35 meters, eventually coming to the cave's entrance, which is blocked off by the steel rebar gate. And again, to get the key to access this deeper section, you have to show the dive shop that you're cave certified. The difference between open water diving and cave diving can't be overstated and requires that divers get an additional 2 months of training, along with 125 additional dives with a certified partner or instructor. The whole reason the gate was installed in the first place was that in the 90s, there were over a dozen deaths in the vortex spring in the cave. This then got the attention of the state, who threatened to ban diving in the spring altogether unless something was done to prevent divers from entering. And from a cave diver's perspective, even from a diver's perspective, it's easy to see why it would be such an attraction. The cave has over 1,600 feet of limestone passages mapped to a depth of 310 feet, and it goes even deeper than this, but is inaccessible simply because the passages become too narrow to continue. Some of these are just 10 inches across, where divers actually have to take their gas tanks off and then twist and contort to get through.
Wait, what?
In the weeks leading up to August 18th, Ben had become well known to the dive shop
Yeah,
employees and
sure.
other divers who frequented the area. They'd see his truck sitting in the parking lot with Ben either by the water side or in the water diving. On the night that he was let through the gate by the employees, instead of waiting around like they sometimes did, they left for the night right away. After all, they had no obligation to wait for him. That was just something that they did out of courtesy. Sometimes they waited and sometimes they didn't. But the following morning, Ben's truck was still parked in the parking lot. That day, no one really noticed because they had other stuff to tend to, and the lot was pretty full anyway. Then, on Friday, they did notice that his truck was parked there, and no one had seen him.
How about you can come over in like 30 minutes?
It was at this point that they called police to investigate his disappearance. Here's where things also start to get weird. Right away, police sealed off the spring to make sure no one else entered and started searching the immediate area and Ben's truck to see if they could find any of his stuff. In the search of the area, they didn't find any of his tanks, his wetsuit, or any other dive equipment that belonged to him, but inside his truck, they found his wallet with $1,100 in cash, his cell phone, and his dive logs. In these logs, they found that he had been exploring the cave for some time and had made a map of it as though the dog hadn't been fed in at least 2 days, so right around the time Ben was thought to have disappeared. Based on this information, both police and employees of the dive shop were pretty convinced that he was still in the cave and it was likely that he drowned. Cadaver dogs were then brought in to search the area and kept leading police right to the water's surface. This seemed to confirm the idea that Ben had entered the water and never left. As the search continued, news spread quickly through the dive community, and cave divers of all levels volunteered to help search the spring in the cave to find Ben's body. At least, the assumption was that it would be a body recovery. Initially, the police thought that this outpouring of support was great and that this would definitely speed up any search efforts, but as more experienced divers got involved, they warned police how difficult of an operation this was. There were just a few dozen people on the planet who had the experience recovering a body in these conditions. The combination of depth, narrow tunnels, and silty conditions meant that if something went wrong, it could easily be 2 body recoveries instead of 1. Eventually, the most experienced divers began searching the cave, often with Ben's parents and girlfriend sitting by the side of the spring, watching and hoping they'd find Ben. Over the first few days, they searched large tunnels and small tunnels, and then they turned their attention to tiny crevices and fissures. An unfortunately all too common phenomenon in cave diving when a divers panic is that they'll swim randomly, trying to find a way and wedge themselves deep into a tiny crevice. Because they're panicked, this causes them to get much further into these narrow tunnels than they otherwise would want to. But obviously, this only makes things worse, and usually shortly after that, they drown. Even the search itself is risky. In fact, within just the first few days, one diver almost died while navigating through the cave. He just narrowly made it out before he himself panicked and ended up stuck and drowned. But incredibly, despite all of these efforts, the only thing they found were some tanks believed to belong to Ben. 3 tanks in total were found, all of which contained regular air. 2 of the tanks were found in the outer cavern area, and one was found about 200 feet into the cave. This was also weird. At least one of these tanks should have contained a gas mixture different than regular air because of the depth he was diving to. With regular air at that depth, the diver would be susceptible to nitrogen narcosis. This is something that Ben would have, or at the very least should have known. And it's likely that he did know this because his dive log showed that he had already entered the cave on several occasions. It's unlikely that he would have survived previous dives if he had the wrong gas mixture, like was found during the search. This only further confused the rescue efforts. By Sunday, so now 4 days after Ben had gone missing, and 2 days after it was realized he was missing, someone from the search party got in contact with diving legend Ed Sorensen. Not only is Ed one of the world's premier cave divers, but he's also a recovery specialist with over 2,500 dives during his long career.
Oh
When he
my
was
god.
contacted, he was actually on an expedition in the Bahamas, but basically right after receiving the text message, he dropped everything and arrived in Florida the following day. When he arrived, the other experienced divers who had already searched told him that going in any further than they had already gone was too dangerous. Ed disagreed with their assessment and then went on to make 3 separate dives. In total, he covered 1,700 feet of the cave and at least 200 more than what Ben had mapped. He even used a dive propulsion vehicle to travel faster and carried smaller tanks to squeeze through narrower openings, but in the end, he found absolutely nothing. No body, no equipment, and even no signs of increased fish activity from fish that might have been feeding on something decaying somewhere in the cave. In fact, there weren't even any markings to suggest that someone might have squeezed their way through some of the tighter tunnels. If someone had squeezed through some of these, they would have dragged and disturbed the sill and marked the walls enough that it would have been noticeable to anyone else. And even weirder than this, Ben was 6'1" and 210 pounds. This is both taller than Ed and 20 pounds heavier. Ed himself found it very unlikely that Ben, who was not trained and not nearly as experienced, could have made it any further than he had. With each subsequent lead coming to a dead end, Ben's parents got more and more desperate. They were willing to try anything and everything for answers about what might have happened. First, they hired the men who originally mapped the cave to try to find him, but 7 dives later, all he was able to offer them was an apology for finding nothing. Next, they put up $50,000 as a deposit for the cost of replacing a remotely operated underwater vehicle. This ROV was then used to search the cave, but unfortunately wasn't able to go any further than what the human cave divers had gone. When the search was finally winding down from the initial frenzy, 16 divers had spent 36 days straight scouring the cave and turned up with nothing. Oftentimes, Ben's parents and girlfriend stood by the waterside, hoping for any sign of him. Beyond this initial search, volunteer divers continued for months afterward, while police turned their attention to the area surrounding the spring. With how thorough the search of the cave had been, it started to seem less likely that he was in there after all. This is also when some alternative theories started to be put forward. Like, for example, maybe his body was removed before searching began. It's possible he did drown, but fearing the spring might get shut down, some other divers pulled him out before anyone found him. The 2 divers who saw him the night he disappeared were questioned, but their stories stayed consistent. Police even had them take a lie detector test, but they passed these and sort of derailed this idea as well. It was also suggested that Ben was washed out through one of the spring's outlets, but then when police scoured the swamps, which were the spring's outflows, they again found nothing. They went on to search the nearby Blue Creek, Sandy Creek, and Choctawhatchee River and tested them 30 separate times over the following months. All of these tests found no indication of any bacteria that would be elevated in the presence of a decomposing body. Further searches with cadaver dogs also came up with nothing from the woods surrounding the spring or the nearby area. This just ended up being another dead end.
That's
Having
weird.
no more than 1 square foot of space? That's bull. Having lots of space? That's Vital Farms.
The portable and modern way to experience fragrance. Upgrade to Airwick Essential Mist.
Another theory suggested by several people was that maybe he had faked his own disappearance. Maybe, with all the stress of the last few years, he needed to start fresh, so he staged his own disappearance to get away from his old life. Although this was technically possible, this didn't seem to make sense either, though. He had seemed so positive in the weeks leading up to it. He had talked to his girlfriend about starting a dive-related business, and even left his parents a letter before leaving their house, promising to take care of them in their old age, because of how much he appreciated their support in the last couple of years. Even more than that, he knew how hard his brother's death was on them. It just wouldn't make sense for him to do that to them, knowing what they went through. At least, this was the opinion of Ben's parents and girlfriend. By 2011, there wasn't much hope from the dive community that Ben would be found anywhere in Vortex Spring, because the search had been ongoing for months and scoured by some of the world's best cave divers. It just seemed impossible that he could actually be in there with all the resources poured into the search. Ben's parents, on the other hand, weren't giving up hope of finding their son. Increasingly frustrated by the lack of answers, they put up a $10,000 reward for quote-unquote anyone brave enough to find him. Whether intentional or not, though, the insinuation that the divers were scared to search for him was kind of an insult to everyone who had spent the last several months volunteering. These individuals were basically risking their lives for someone who technically shouldn't have been entering the cave at all. The fear was also that by offering money, it might attract divers who weren't really qualified to be doing recoveries. But, despite the criticism they received for this decision, they went on to increase the amount of the reward twice, eventually to a total of $30,000. And just like the dive community warned, eventually this fear was realized in March of 2012. That month, a diver went into the cave one day and never exited. The following day, his body was found and then eventually recovered by Ed Sorensen. It looked as though he had gotten lost or panicked and couldn't find his way back and eventually drowned. Although there was no explicit evidence that he was searching for Ben, Ed thought that this was the case because he was found near a shovel left near a restriction that was impossibly small. And to reach this restriction, Ed had to pass through 4 other tight restrictions. This was far beyond the normal range of cave divers who frequented the spring. This death only prompted more criticism from the dive community, and especially Ed. As the one who had done the recovery, he knew intimately how the reward resulted in people risking their lives searching, and the lives of rescuers who ended up having to recover these bodies afterward. Following this, Ben's parents finally rescinded the offer. They now firmly believed that if Ben wasn't in the cave, he was likely the victim of foul play. While all of this was going on, they had hired a private investigator to look into the dive shop and its employees. This investigator ended up finding out that several of the employees had criminal records and that the owner was currently facing serious criminal charges. Sometime before the disappearance, the owner hired a temporary employee who later ended up owing him money. Allegedly, the owner then took this employee out into the woods and assaulted him with a baseball bat, trying to get him to pay the money he owed. Thankfully, this employee ended up escaping and running off. As a result, in 2011, so